So Shido's been defeated, Akechi's been imprisoned, and we've killed a god!
False god. Dead false god.
The only thing left to do now is enjoy life and the time we have left in the game. Such as, if you've signed up for any of the Paramore routes, going with them on a Christmas date, since Christmas Eve in Japan is a big couples thing. Unfortunately, with this being one of the 2 designated sleepover nights with the chosen girl, this is what I've been talking about all game, with idiots thinking the game encouraged pedophilia if you did these events with Tai, Kawakami, Chihaya, or Oya. Canonically, nothing sexually explicit happens. But again, even if it did, the protagonist is at least 17 now, above Japan's legal age of consent, and in a pre-existing relationship, so consent actually matters there. So all legal ways of objecting to anything happening are entirely null and void. Hell, even if you do that with Futaba with her being younger than Ren, then that still wouldn't flag for that due to there only being a single year of an age difference between them. And Atlus will never confirm in any Persona game that the Christmas and Valentine's events provide evidence of the protagonist and their girlfriend going bow chicka bow wow. So, from the start, it was always a straw man argument. And hey, next morning, it's a Christmas miracle, as Morgana's back!
And there was much rejoicing.
So yeah, with Akechi's confession making Sai's casework a cakewalk, with her even able to find the woman that Shido assaulted in 2015, even Ren's prior frame job will get overturned. And anything he might have done illegal while on parole won't count against him. Life is good. Too good, in fact. Almost as if it's a dream. Oh god fucking damn it. Yeah, if only reality was as simple as the world we fantasize about and idealize, right?
できるわけないだ。夢ばっかり見てちゃいけない。今がなくちゃいつかもない。
Things immediately get weird on January 1st, however, with the group meeting up by coincidence at a shrine to ring in the new year. And that's where this happens.
ごめん。この後すぐ家族で出かけるの。
俺も寄るところがある。
私もお父様と食事。私はこれからお母さんと初売り巡り。
Excuse me, what?
それじゃあ私たちはそろそろ行こうか。見て。
The escalation of this continues, with Morgana taking human form, Ren rushing downstairs, and finding everyone living in a delusion that is distorting their perceptions of reality. Or rather, reality is now directly being distorted by the wishes of the people. Sojiro and Futaba eating with a resurrected from the dead Wakaba Ishiki, with no one else there seeing anything wrong, as if she never died to begin with.
ごめんごめん。
そろそろコーヒー入れとくか。
気づいてるだろ。この状況について話したい。
Because of fucking course they would. Now this is something that actually irritates and angers me, and how so many characters that play a tritagonist role are allowed to get away with their fucking crimes. In short, something erased everything Akechi did. Yes, all of it. Everything regarding Shido and the conspiracy has been undone from the point Akechi was first empowered by the Demiurge. And every victim of his, or those who were the victims of those he distorted, has been brought back from the dead or healed of their injuries. Now this ends up triggering a bit of a conflict for people who were paying attention to that prior scene. Remember how I showcased that bit of Makoto going to spend time with her family? As in, more than just Sai? As if it was just Sai, she'd say her sister. But again, her father died 3 years ago. A year more than Akechi's empowerment. And later scenes of this arc show that wasn't a mistake. Her father is back from the dead, like everyone else killed or harmed from Akechi's actions. Thus, if Akechi's actions are the first major change, and everything spirals outwards from there, then how is this affecting her life circumstances as well already? Unless, as proposed before, her father was supposed to be one of the victims of the conspiracy, and thus was brought back by that conspiracy in its entirety being wiped from existence. But it's another reason why it would have just so simplified and streamlined part of the game's narrative if Akechi was responsible for not 2, but 3 of the team members' parents' deaths. Well, to be clear, Akechi's actions being undone is not the first event, nor even the second. The changes, in fact, started with Ren and his wishes and spiraled out from there. So following that line of logic back, not even Morgana's return is the first event. It is instead Akechi himself suddenly not being dead, and not being the monstrous distortion the game has been depicting him as. With that then spiraling out to everyone Ren is personally connected to through his confidants, for this force to begin granting their subconscious wishes. Now this ends up being a mistake. Not the entire wish-granting going wrong arc that is part of this entire Royal Extra chapter, but them reviving Akechi at all for these events. Because as I inferred last time, it is complicating the narrative of their game by presenting sympathy for the devil. Now, I cut around it a lot because I frankly hate those parts of the scene, but the writers throughout this keep trying to make Akechi into a sympathetic man that everyone should be able to get behind redeeming his actions due to the circumstances he lived through. And it doesn't fucking work. 2, potentially 3 of the cast members have lost their families due to the conspiracy, with 2 of them being directly caused by actions Akechi himself took all in the name of revenge over his father. And the game just expects us to suddenly overlook that when he finally pays for the consequences of his actions? No! Hell no! Akechi has not earned nor is warranted a redemption arc. While the Demiurge gave him power, by his very nature as a Persona user, the Demiurge had no control over what he did. His sins are his own, and he must be held accountable for them. And I and others are so absolutely sick and fucking tired of Japanese writers doing this with 11th hour plot reveals around characters like this to try and claim that they aren't the villains that they have spent the story being written as. One person's shitty backstory does not excuse the evils and malice they spread. It just means there is a nuance and reasoning to their actions that can justify why we despise them. As other people in his same straits, once he in fact caused, did not give in to the darkness to become the same morally bankrupt void of emptiness that he is. And considering everything I've said about Suzaku this last year, it's another reason I view the comparison as apt, as both series try and outright make excuses for the evil they spread, so they don't have to take responsibility for it ever. Death Equals Redemption has more and more come to be considered a worthless plot device as there's little shown that they actually mean it, that they actually show any sign of true reformation through the action. As I've said before, the apology is the start, not the end. You have to show them actually acting to make amends and correcting their poor behavior after admitting they were wrong, in order to find any wide acceptance of that with their end. But that can only occur after they show regret and consequently change, which a Death Equals Redemption act cannot tangibly show.
Tell me, do you think I'll see Kakarot when I die?
What, like in heaven? Because... no.
Okay, fuck you! But... fair.
Yeah, not every character gets to be fucking Piccolo or Vegeta from Dragon Ball, where they spend years going from villain to ally of circumstance to rival Kun before their edges soften enough to come to realize they were wrong, and get the shit beaten out of them along the way as a means of making up for their poor prior life choices. As that's a long-form redemption arc, where they show tangible evidence of changing well before their deaths, where the death is the capstone to their redemption arc, not the redemption arc in and of itself. To just skip to it with their ends not long after they have this realization, we don't accept that anymore with a character that is the root of all evils behind a series of circumstances, and from those facilitating and enabling the other villains. As far too often, it really has been used as a means of excusing past conduct, which they have shown no remorse for. And those other villains Akechi enabled or created would not have become the threats they are had those specific individuals not been the entire reason their malice existed. And that is what having him here takes away. The only circumstances, literally the only valid ones by which Akechi can be alive, is so as to make him a recurring villain throughout any of the following games. And this is not helped at all by the developer's statements on the matter. Where in an interview about the royal content, they deliberately changed this because of a vocal minority of players who wanted Akechi to survive, but didn't grasp the reason why he was wanted back, which was all tied to how he was the perfect candidate for overarching villain beyond the petty schemes of his sperm donor and the false god of control as a fantastic foil for the Phantom Thieves who would sow more chaos they could correct in sequel media, like the games Strikers and Tactica. Because Akechi is the Masato Kusaka. He is the Suzaku Kururugi. He is the Seymour Guado from Final Fantasy X. He is the tritagonist whose narrative purpose is to screw with the heroes while working to ruin their happy ending, just out of sheer spite towards them not getting their way. Yet as they spoke of it, they framed this decision to revive him as the audience wanting him back as a good guy, repenting for his actions, which is only possible if you complete his Confidant. When, no. Fuck no. You are not putting this on us when the original framing of the game was you needed to complete the Confidants in order for the character you were playing to live. The entire point of his type of character story is he doesn't want to repent, nor believes he needs to, because he is thoroughly deluded into believing his actions were right from the start to get what he wants, regardless of consequences. And no amount of defeat equals friendship is going to change that about Akechi. That is what it means to be the living distortion embodying the sin of emptiness. So Akechi either needed to die and stay dead, be arrested attempting to escape and only admit to what he did to stick it to his dad to ruin his dad's life, or he needed to maintain his primary villain status by continuing to seed distortions to new victims the Phantom Thieves would then need to put right. This attempt at a last-minute redemption of Akechi, both ways around, almost ruined the game for several people due to the straight myopia towards it, how just openly despised such conduct has become from other Japanese authors that do this, and has as its foundation far better grounds than the complaints levied against other cast members. For while the hate Makoto and Futaba got was entirely unfounded when one pays attention to their arcs, and realized most of the problems came from the bad localization of their chapters, a reconsideration for Akechi to be anything but a villain will require one deliberately ignore all the evils he himself is responsible for, and agree with the very same blame-shifting that this group refused to let any other palace ruler get away with. It would showcase an outright hypocritical sentiment to all the others they condemned if Akechi were not held to the same standards. And yet that is what the writers, and portions of the fandom, attempted, instead of actually doubling down as they should have and let Akechi go out with something along the lines of, "I will not lose! Not to anyone! Not even you!"
I'll never give it up! Not to anyone!
Because even when completing Akechi's Blood Oath, that's not a redemption. His Arcana representation does not instantaneously flip to being right side up from being in reverse. He still represents what he did from the start, the sword protecting the powerful from receiving the judgment they deserve. His last stand is just that, refusing to let his bastard of a sperm donor win, and doing it out of nothing but sheer spite, because the Phantom Thieves are now the only ones that can give him, even in death, his victory. not because he actually gives a shit about them. Every human member of the Phantom Thieves, chronologically from Futaba to Haru, has suffered personal hardship and been victimized, all as a result of what Akechi himself has caused. Why the hell would you even try to write them as forgiving him in circumstances like they did at his last stand? And that is the entire problem with Akechi's appearances here. By all evidence presented in the game, blood oath or not, Akechi should not be depicted as a sympathetic ally to Ren in this game, because Ren has no reason at all to view him as such. The only reason Akechi is here, the absolutely only reason, is Atlas insisted that the protagonist of Persona 5 remain a fucking mute through the grand majority of its events. Whereas if Joker actually did have regular lines of dialogue, there would be no reason for him to be here, as Ren would be his own sounding board, instead of Akechi having to explain everything for the audience himself. Internally in story, however, and not outside of it, the only way this technically works is the wish system that's being exploited now is deeply, deeply flawed and broken, which it is later shown to be, and is shortcutting solutions to the problems posed against it to brute force the wish granting. Ren wishes there's another way to get Shido, bam, Akechi's brought back. Everyone else reminisces about what they've lost because of these events, wham, their loved ones are back. And as a consequence of that, Akechi's sins are erased. By that same token, Akechi should then cease to exist, because this Akechi is not real. He is a cognitive echo built from and reflecting the popular perception of who he was, and not the monster that was the truth of him who hid behind his mask. Which is what so pisses me off about this. Because Cognitive Akechi in Royal's last chapter did nothing but further poison the discourse around the game, with people claiming that this is the real Akechi, when that flies in the face of everything he was guilty of, and the truth we finally were allowed to see of him. Now, in all absolute fairness to the game developers, in the interview where they revealed why they brought back Akechi in the way they did here, they said they knew it was going to be a controversial choice. They were aware of the fandom response to several characters being divisive depending on how much one paid attention to the story and how clear their points in its exposition were. And yes, they were also aware of the poor localization of the game outside of Japan. So, they knew going in there would inevitably be pushback on that for the reasons I have listed. And they were taking a risk of undermining that Akechi was a villain by doing it after they already tried to invoke sympathy towards him at the end of the original story. They approached this aware of how it could appear as worsening the intended portrayal, but they moved forward anyways in hopes what they wrote would not further compound the issue. And you know what? I respect that. No, really, I do. So often, so frequently when I've done reviews over the years, the most blindingly obvious stupid decisions are ones that the writers should have known, or were ones that were taken out of their hands, and we on the outside of the industry aren't aware of that. And we can only work with what is publicly known. So, for a writer to actually come out and say, this might have been the wrong choice, people may take it the wrong way, but it is the choice I made in order to tell the story I wanted to tell, I can disagree and feel the way they did it doesn't necessarily make such better, but unlike other decisions, it doesn't necessarily destroy Persona 5's story in the process through Royal doing this. The worst it does, though, is what they were concerned about from the start. It does undermine Akechi's depiction as a villain. And that's a bigger thing to me specifically, simply because, again, I'm sick of evil people getting off scot-free for their actions, and it keeps coming off as Akechi being an exception to that rule when it shouldn't be. And that's why I feel making it up to the player and framing it as the bond that they form with him being what saves Akechi is the biggest mistake in this, as it makes it seem like they were washing their hands of responsibility, instead of them revealing he is still actually alive and insane, and this cognitive Akechi is a complete fake, in order to be able to do more with him, to quantify him better in the sequels as a deliberate villain. That way, you get a redemption arc rejection out of it, through which to expand on and cement the point. But unfortunately, they didn't do that either. And with Tatsuka having Akechi and Sumi as DLC companions, it either feels like they cave to a vocal minority that don't see him as the villain he is, or has been the condemnation. They were looking for ways to excuse his actions to keep bringing him back as an ally, when he shouldn't be from the start. Though in its own way, there is a qualifier for this cognitive Akechi being here, as this Akechi knows that he is not the real Akechi. And because this cognitive Akechi is based on the Detective Prince persona that is a lie, it is still going to help us with this case, even though it will mean that it ceases to exist. Why? Because this is the image Akechi projected to the populace of himself, which has been all poured into this lie, of a man who would do this for others, even though the real one never actually would. It is again the larger problem of the fandom taking things the wrong way with the characters. But as was the purpose of my little rant in part 1 in regards to Persona 3 and 4, that was always present. Persona 5 just got it worse. So yeah, there's only one possible source for this reality rewrite, and it's the palace we found all the way back in October. Sumi contacting us and also telling us things are weird over in Odaiba, where it has intersected with the real world. Entering this aberrant palace, we see it now being populated by shadows waiting to see medical workers, them waiting in lines to make use of the services of the facility. And I gotta admit, this place feels full-on culty. Not unexpected from the cult of personality a palace ruler can create, but this feels outright overt with the cult homages. Which is not unexpected. Several cults in Japan, and elsewhere in the world such as Scientology, frame themselves as being based in science or medical study through which to fix what ails a person, either physically, emotionally, or psychologically. It's unfortunately another of the reasons why mental health care has become so stigmatized, as so very many people have been made to believe by popular media biases that psychiatrists and psychologists are lying to them, don't know what they're talking about, and make what they're trying to help with worse, or are trying to con them with things that don't work. And you know what? Having seen therapists in the past myself, it doesn't always help depending on what the issue is. In my case, I saw a therapist in my teens for extreme social anxiety, and in those years was on anti-anxiety medication recommended by them. But none of it ultimately helped deal with my social phobias. I in fact still have them to this day. But that's because there's in fact nothing wrong with me having them, as being uncomfortable around people is just part of who I am. I am an introverted person who doesn't like dealing with other people, and it was just a matter of me finding ways to manage my anxiety to get me better, which the therapists I saw were not succeeding in, because there was an expectation that they would be making me able to fit in normally. But the problem is, normal is subjective. Thus, the exercises they had me perform, the medication they had me on, and the stigma that I had to fit in ultimately were doing more harm than good due to how it kept making me feel deliberately isolated instead of there being an acceptance that I am not a person that likes being around other people. And this refusal to let me be ended up a contributing factor to me almost killing myself 16 years ago. It was actually after I had my self-actualization epiphany, once again, thank you, .hackgu, that I ended up starting to be better. I still can't stand up in front of a group to do a presentation, but I'm not going to be in a place where I have to begin with. However, it was still important for me to have seen therapists, as in doing everything that didn't work, I eventually found what would help and what to avoid. Granted, my situation was different from matters of actual trauma, debilitating neuroses, or delusion-causing mental disorders, or trauma that triggers any of the above, that cause someone to lash out and attack others, or become entirely non-functional in life where there is an actual outside cause, that talk, medication help with chemical imbalances, and actual empathy can help someone cope with and work to overcome. Sometimes you do just need a safe space and an understanding, open mind by which to draw comfort from, especially when the individuals involved are trained and knowledgeable on different methods to help people cope and come to terms with their experiences. But the problem is such is not a cure-all. As I described with my situation, what helped me was finally having it be acknowledged that I was never going to be a social butterfly, so trying to turn me into one was always going to be damaging. But conversely, therapy can also become harmful if it begins to become a crutch, no longer helping one improve. That if you are not continuously progressing with battling your mental issues to overcome them, until you reach the point you can just stamp down on them under heel when they try and attack, then you can become just as obsessed with the comfort the caretaker can bring. This is seen quite often by Tony Shalhoub's character Adrian Monk in his series Monk, where he makes progress in handling his mental issues only to backslide and need more attention of his therapists. As much as he generally needed psychiatric help, his dependency at times could be self-defeating in obtaining the goal of him getting better. And it is this crutch of dependency in the psychological health and recovery of a person where cults often do come into play to exploit them, manipulating that need for care and comfort in an unforgiving world, and turning that need for an accepting bond into a chain that shackles them by making the victim falsely believe they can only get that acceptance from the cult, its members, and an object of worship, that they are powerless to do it themselves, and must give all of themselves up to another person or thing to be better, when that's not therapy or healing or reformation. That's a distraction. It tricks them into thinking that proper mental care and difficulty in getting back into that healthy headspace is just a scam. And there's easier ways only the cult can provide, despite that all being a lie manipulating one's dependency, that they never get over it. And it consequently gets those victims to only turn towards those who reinforce their worst impulses, desires, or neuroses, which are harmful and should be learned to cope with, instead shutting everyone else out. And thus the cults give them what these victims want, but not what they need. Hell, we had a bit of that earlier in the game with Chihiya's Confidant story. And frankly, I feel her story is better because of the royal extended content, making it so she's someone who only just avoided becoming the spokeswoman for a group like this. And if you need any more evidence of this palace's basis being on cultism over actual therapy, well, a funny story. It's based on a real cult. One of the most infamous modern cults in Japan, which is explicitly named Happy Science, which is large enough to have its own political faction, known as the Happiness Realization Party. And then it wasn't just being spoofed here, but was also the basis for Hideaki Anno's revamp and remake of the villain organization Shocker in Anno's Shin Kamen Rider film. Happy Science is scary with its indoctrination, even having a rivalry with the infamous Shinrikyo cult in the 90s. Actively proclaims North Korea and China are plotting the nuclear destruction of Japan, and engages in racist historical revisionism revolving around the crimes against humanity Japan committed against Korea in World War II. And they are full-on anti-vaccination lunatics, defrauding thousands when they claimed they had a spiritual cure to COVID-19, which they then charged over $400 for during the height of the pandemic. Their founder, Ryoho Okawa, claimed to have had a moment of spiritual enlightenment in the 1980s that led to him forming an institution that would move forward bringing happiness to all through merging science and divinity as a living incarnation of a god his worshippers believed to have been called Odin, Osiris, Hermes, and Shakyamuni Buddha in different religions, which was done to give him the perception of authority. But Okawa's son Hiroshi believes his father to have been living in a delusion and was suffering from mental health problems himself, and thus eventually realized what was happening and spoke out against him, leading to Hiroshi being disowned by him. Fortunately for everyone swindled by the cult, Happy Science is on the decline, with COVID and their fake vaccines for it crushing their membership, Hiroshi's denouncing of his father waking others up and getting them to leave, and Ryoho Okawa's death in 2023 dropping their membership even further, with their messiah now being gone. Because most cults collapse once their head themselves dies or is taken away. And who is running this cult that is making the world go right? For once? Well, it is the final confidant we have not talked about. The palace ruler is revealed to be Dr. Takuto Maruki, who has gone full-on Sosuke Aizen.
我は汝、汝は我。汝、ここに新たなるちぎりを得たり。ちぎりはすなわち、囚われを破らんとする反逆の翼なり。我、顧問官のペルソナの生誕に祝福の風を得たり。自由へと至る、さらなる力とならん。
Takuto Maruki is introduced to us in Persona 5 Royal on May 13th, hired as a grief counselor for Shujin Academy in the wake of Kamoshida's confessions, primarily because he was already associated with the school thanks to his work with Tsumi before this in working her through the grief of her sister's passing. Over the course of the game's earlier sects, he slowly has scenes meeting with all the principal cast members to learn about them and how they feel about their respective hardships, analyzing them as a psychologist, but never giving tangible advice, just listening, and seeming to guide them to foregone conclusions and reveal more than they may have wanted to with how he seems just an open person. I mean, he's a psychologist. We can trust and confide in him, right? Has anyone gotten the pattern yet? For the most part, Maruki in the original sect of the game comes off as primarily benign, just a sounding board for events. With it revealed over time, his specialization is in helping one reshape their own cognition of themselves. Basically a shorthanded means of saying one can fix their own problems when one thinks about them the right way, and it's merely finding the right way to do so, which is the trick and consequential difficulty of psychiatry. For as I've said before, you can't fix a problem without understanding what the actual cause of it is.
僕から最後のカウンセリングです。辛かったら逃げてください。目の前にある理不尽な現実が全てだって思わないでほしい。
中の正義を見失わない。そんな君と出会えて本当に良かったと思ってる。根性の別れってわけじゃないけど、今まで本当にありがとう。
我は汝、汝は我。汝ここにちぎりを血明の絆へと転生せしめたり。絆は反逆の翼となりて、魂のくびきを打ち破らん。今こそ汝、顧問官の究極なる非王に目覚めたり。無尽の力を汝に与えん。
In this respect, he actually is good and well suited for his job. Except for one rather glaring oversight. And that's where the overall issue with the stigma against mental health professionals is consequently placed in fictional media as well as the real world. I'm not sure if the game developers were calling it out or falling into the same trap, but the issue that consistently appears is they keep depicting therapists as not helping people to overcome their trauma and neuroses or cope with them, but forget that they exist, which in fiction near universally leads to relapses in the ones receiving therapy, as just suppressing something does nothing to deal with it. This is especially dangerous as Maruki, like Wakaba, is also a researcher into the psychology of the Metaverse, taking a high level of interest in the activities of the Phantom Thieves because the changes of cognition they perform by stealing the heart of a distortion immediately removes the mental blinders on one's actions, and Maruki's curiosity towards them is raised in how this could be applied towards a therapeutic role, but in reverse. To put a blinder on a person so what their traumas are won't affect them. In fact, because of the revelation that this is in fact Maruki's palace, it puts in context why Sumi so easily awakened to a persona. The therapy Maruki has been taking Sumi through has actually been harming her mental well-being instead of helping it, as we saw throughout the first half of her Confidant, where she more and more feels like she is not herself. Her persona awakening is consequently her lashing out at and rebelling against the individual whose attempts to pacify her trauma have done nothing but make her feel this way, like a stranger in her own skin, which has not helped her fix anything in her life.
けど、吉沢さんは怪盗団のことをどう思う？怪盗団ですか。本当にいるとしたらってことですよね。人助けは素晴らしいことだと思います。けど、私は賛成はできないかもしれません。なるほど。理由も聞かせてもらえたりする？怪盗団のような存在って結局は世の中のためにならない気がするんです。どうして？例えば壁とか問題が目の前にあったとしたら、それは自分で乗り越えていくものだと思うんです。周りの人に助けてもらうことはあっても、あくまで自分で努力して解決する。けど怪盗団みたいに何でも助けてくれる存在がいたら努力することをやめてしまいそうで、もちろん問題の大きさにもよりますし、一概に言えないのは分かってるんですけど、本人が頑張ることをやめて全部怪盗団任せになる世の中も、それはそれで良くない気がするんです。
This is all seen throughout the earliest sects of Maruki's palace, as she's put on display herself as a poster child to claim that Maruki's methodology works. And much like with the collapse of Shido's palace feeding the power of Mementos, the death of the Demiurge has shunted all the power previously trapped there to this last hidden palace in turn, giving Maruki the power over cognition he needs to warp reality and create a utopia where no one will ever suffer trauma again. Now, here's the thing about all this. Maruki is the final villain of the game, but he's not villain tier like Akechi, Shido, and the Demiurge. Oh, he is certainly fucking up the world without care, and is acting recklessly against the public well-being to do it, but he genuinely believes he is doing a good thing by removing everyone's grief and creating a world where our hopes and dreams can be provided to us on a silver platter. At least until you start thinking about it. As you can't always get what you want. Really, you can't always get what you want, especially if it means others will be deprived of the same opportunities. For there is one caveat, one key, core, obnoxious caveat that keeps ringing in my head every time this guy, or the character he draws parallels to, ever pops his face on screen, promoting his way being better for others. And that is, did you even ask them? Did you ever ask the people whose lives you're affecting, for all intents and purposes manipulating, about what they actually wanted? Or did you assume, taking advantage of their pain, their suffering, their hardship, just to transplant what you thought would work without their willing consent? And the answer to that is no. He did not bother. And that is the biggest issue here. For like all the palace rulers in Akechi, he's doing it because he believes that he has the right to do it. In this respect, in the event anyone thought I overlooked him, this makes Maruki the Schneisel El Britannia of the game, due to him being a background manipulator who thinks he knows best for everyone, but in that same regard considered no one's perspective but his own, arrogantly presuming the stagnant world that he would shape would be better than the one that already exists, but because he considers none but himself, doesn't understand the true aberrancies to what he designs, to consider how monstrous it is, due to his outright fear towards actually considering any alternatives that are not his own. The consequences of such we thus see play out across this arc. But unlike the other rulers and his equivalent counterparts, it's all due to the therapist not actually listening and considering others' needs, despite claiming to be working towards his goals for them. All of his actual therapy sessions do is just reinforce his own standpoint, instead of at all reflecting upon the numerous diverse ways people deal with and work to overcome hardship, which he is in turn not doing himself for his own trauma. As is revealed in his Confidant Arc, Mariki is himself still suffering from the grief of losing the woman he loved, Rumi, who when they were visiting her parents were the victims of a burglar. The incident so traumatizing his girlfriend that alongside the murder of her parents in the incident, she suffered a mental breakdown. Rumi was Mariki's life, and he's never learned to cope with that incident. And in fact, he has coped less than others have because of his psychology background. Because the saying is true, doctors make for the worst patients. And also because he's been attempting this same form of therapy for years, only for it to always backfire and harm the patients, him even getting investors behind his new forms of treatment have all dried up, thanks to continue the cult allegory, all be discredited as junk science. The funding drying up primarily as his treatments were found to have violated the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm, as Mariki is obsessed not with curing someone, but making them ignore or forget their pain.
Damn it, Bones, you're a doctor. You know that pain and guilt can't be taken away with the wave of a magic wand. They're the things we carry with us, the things that make us who we are. If we lose them, we lose ourselves. I don't want my pain taken away, I need my pain!
Granted, the story later reveals that Mariki's funding ultimately got pulled thanks to the actions of Masayoshi Shido, as Mariki, through this, is revealed to have been the person who first clued Shido into the existence of the Metaverse, and Shido didn't want anyone else stumbling upon it in the midst of the conspiracy's manipulations of it through Akechi. But there's more than enough grounds to believe he had an easy time getting Mariki's funding pulled, thanks to the junk science involved. But consequently, that is what has formed the foundation of his palace. Mariki is ultimately projecting his pain and pursuing a way so no one will have to suffer such sorrow again. But instead of doing things the right way, and working towards living with it and healing in a healthy way when it does happen, or implementing ways to prevent such circumstances from occurring, all he is doing is taking shortcuts and trying to cut out that trauma to pretend it never existed. But in cutting it out, there's still the matter of the gaping wound left behind that he isn't addressing, which isn't being allowed to heal. And consequently, he is turning everyone affected by this hollow, empty, into what are effectively pleasure zombies that value less what they do have, because the constant comfort numbs them to the truth of reality for others who are not as fortunate. There are those who are not being helped by this effect, and also those who are worse off for what Mariki is in fact doing, which are all being ignored. To say nothing of those it devalues the lives of, for the struggles they've overcome to succeed in life are now made meaningless, for the efforts to surpass that pain have been what have defined their lives. And now that they no longer have that, it leads them to be drifting and aimless. And thus, this is the final sin of man where Mariki's palace has shaped itself around: despair and sorrow. And it doesn't seem like it to a lot of people, because in that 7-sin system, despair is lumped in with sloth, despite there being different triggers once again for sloth and despair. Sloth is laziness, where you give up thought and choice, whereas despair is founded more in the absence of motivation and pursuing distractions to prevent yourself from thinking on things that are harmful, which can render you in a state of being in a mental blue screen perpetually. Because Mariki has never escaped that moment where he lost Rumi, and is inflicting that state of being trapped in that moment where he lost everything, and wished he could change it on everyone else. This big scheme of his is all a distraction from him accepting that he will never get her back.
I see her like this. Every time I close my eyes, in the darkness, in the blink of an eye, I see her like this.
None of your past experiences help prepare you for this consequence.
And I have never figured out how to live without her.
And both Billy Kametz in the English dub as well as Satoshi Hino completely nail this portrayal of a man being unable to overcome his personal loss, and yet somehow keeps trying to make excuses for it. Hell, due to Billy Kametz's passing, this theme of sorrow is delivered all the more pointedly. Though Satoshi Hino's own take is no slouch either, due to him having played individuals that have suffered complete and total failure themselves. Such as these two models of failure from the Yu-Gi-Oh! Franchise. And if that's not enough, Hino also voices Shiage Hamazura, the other eternally unlucky level 0 from the Raildex franchise, as well as Ain's own Gaon Momonga in Overlord. Just to show that it's kinda Hino's wheelhouse to be able to sway one moment from complete loser to compassionless conqueror. And yes, that lack of compassion is showcased almost immediately, as every palace has a victim staining its walls. And in this case, it's Sumi that has become that sacrifice. Because... Kasumi Yoshizawa died a year ago. All game long, our companion has been her sister, Sumire, a sister that was jealous of Kasumi's natural talent and felt herself inferior in comparison to her. Maruki has spent the last year trapping Sumire in Kasumi's shadow and unable to move on from that tragedy. All incited by Sumire telling him that she wanted to make Kasumi's dreams as a gymnast come true in her place. And Maruki chose to help her by reinforcing Sumire's own imposter syndrome into a full-on delusion. That it was better if she herself had died, and not the real Kasumi, in order for Sumire to become Kasumi. Maruki's ideal therapy is in every regard the wrong way to deal with such traumas, as they only further the continuance of them in the background. Such as how in the first half of her Confidant Arc, Sumi can constantly feel something is off, punishing herself for not being good enough, not being strong enough. But these aren't coming from her shortcomings at being a gymnast or as a person, but this rooted, untreated wound Maruki was deliberately allowing to fester by her not being allowed to acknowledge and move past this one horrible moment in her life. But as we also saw, her desire to improve herself, even when she couldn't remember being Sumire, as that was the mindset Kasumi always had to in everything that Sumire generally was inspired by from her sister's life, that was the trigger for her own rebellion and the first half of Sumi's Confidant Arc, even when still under the delusion that while she does all these things to improve herself, they will never be anywhere as effective as being herself, which she was always trying to get back to in order to cope with and overcome her loss, as she could never move forward to improve like she wanted to surpass her sister without first doing so. But Maruki would not allow that.
残酷な事実は消え、幸せな認知の中で人々は生きる。それが救いでなくて何だって言うんだい。
My rule will spread quickly across the real world, eventually allowing me to control people's very hearts.
Yeah, this is that stagnancy trap that Maruki is inflicting on everyone with his wishes, and he just doesn't see it, continuing to believe it's better despite the rejections presented by everyone made aware of it, as one can only be distracted from the problems for so long before the underlying issue kills them. And that's not an exaggeration. People need goals. Things that get them out of bed every day to go out and achieve for themselves. We are instinctually, biologically driven to do things with our lives for, at the very least, ourselves and our own sanity, if not contributing in some way to the greater society around us. Like again, my hobby is building stuff and completing things, because they're all short-term achievable goals that give me that shot of dopamine to feel satisfied with myself when things aren't all that great. But imagine just one getting the dopamine shot for doing nothing. That all it required you to be to get one of those boosts is feel the slightest bit sad. If that happened, would you ever do anything again? Would you feel the motivation to do anything again? To value anything? Because there's two ways to motivate someone: the pursuit of success and the avoidance of failure or pain. But remove the stigma of the latter, and regardless of circumstances, grant them the rewards of the former, and what becomes the point of anything? You are trapped in a world where everything becomes meaningless, and there's no point in actually living. That becomes a textbook definition of despair, as there is no escaping a life made worthless. And that is the ultimate escalation for this. For because Sumire remembering her true self has caused her to abruptly lose her spark of rebellion, Marky is able to take her captive, and without the rest of the team backing him up, Joker is just plainly outmatched, even if he has obtained the likes of Izanagi no Okami and Satanael. Thus, Marky gives Joker an ultimatum: to accept this new world that he is creating. See it with his own eyes, how it is better, before deciding to oppose him. Yeah, that's the thing. We have. He hasn't. But he's genuine in saying we have a choice. The player can give up and join the rest of the pleasure zombies, wasting away his days in bliss until he no longer has the motivation to get up in the morning anymore, and just dies in his sleep. A literal textbook definition of death by despair, with everyone else suffering the same. Shido and the Demiurge might have made a world of slaves if they had gotten their way, and that isn't a life worth living at all, but gotta admit, genocide through bliss isn't often seen on the rotating wheel of extermination. But it is in this ending that we find one of the things that was actually cut from the game as an option to do. That being the other harem ending. As I alluded to from the first time I discussed the Paramore options, the game developers did originally intend for there to be a way to get a cinematic where the protagonist can get into a relationship with every romanceable character in the game, and for them to not want to kick in Joker's crotch for it. The consequence of that, however, is it was originally scripted to occur as part of the Accept Marky's World path. For a happy harem ending is one of those traditional wish fulfillment scenarios. Now, unconventional familial scenarios have ended up a bit more commonplace over the years, but a full harem where it's one person that's the focus of it? No, that's difficult in normal circumstances, and utterly impossible when all the other partners were not aware of the others being involved up front. Realistically, the only plausible way such a scenario would work is 1. They're honest and upfront on the matter from the start, so the other partners are aware of each other with no deception taking place. And 2. The others in the relationship just as much like and are attracted to their fellow members, so that it's not a dot intersecting several disparate lines, but multiple interconnected relationships forming a close-knit social structure. A polycule, not polygamy. But even then, that is insanely difficult to even put in motion, and impossible without honesty from the start. And really, this scene even more shows the problems of Marky's world, as the reason why the girls are accepting of the harem scenario is not because they got past the inciting lie and they care enough about the protagonist to be able to work through that, but just that they don't care enough for it to matter. Or rather, they can't care enough to object to what Ren did, or him dating other women besides them. it's not because of love or happiness, or them enjoying the presence of the others around them enough to put aside their own desire for affection to allow it to be also granted to another from your own object of affection. It is not from a lack of justified jealousy, but just from the sheer apathy of them not caring enough to raise an objection or feel hurt from the consequences of being betrayed by their lover being with someone else without your knowledge. There is a reason the guilt trip is so effective in the original harem ending scenario, and it is because of them all voicing those feelings of betrayal that undercuts any bond you actually intended to form with them. And the two so strongly contrast each other to show that the acceptance path for it is anything but acceptance, more them going along with it as they aren't being allowed to object, while they become more and more a withered, dying version of themselves. I can only guess at why access to the scene was removed, the most logical one being that the developers did not want the players to deliberately choose the genocide route just to see the harem scenario play out, as it was always going to be bait incentivizing one to fall into a death trap. But of course, due to all the discourse around the game, I think in the view of the developers might have seen the need to take this out so idiots wouldn't take something like this the wrong way, or deliberately choose the bad ending to promote the false perception that Atlus was promoting bad relationships. It was still found in the completed game files though, translated and everything, making it worth mentioning a lot more than the mess with Hifumi, but a last-minute exclusion that was probably for the best. Thus, in order to take back reality, we need to prove Maruki wrong, and his way harms more than it helps. It first requiring Ren remind all his companions of why they fought back and rebelled to begin with. As it's always been clear, idle thoughts and wistful wishes of what could be were never what they needed. Ryuji's already done everything to repair his relationships with the track team on his own. An is still good friends with Shiho, and they were working through their own respective roles in her injuries. Yusuke was taking back the agency of his art. Makoto and Sai were repairing their relationship and looking into ways to carry on their father's ideals at last. Futaba was becoming independent once again, and Haru smashing the cage of her father's actions. All of this was robbed from them by swaddling them in comforting blankets until it threatens to smother them outright. And yet even there, these granted wishes are imperfect. Read through the dialogue, and there's this nagging awareness, the same with Sumire, that something is wrong, that this is not real, that their true selves are rejecting the fake reality as nothing but a dream. But what eventually snaps them all out of it is the realization that they are all violating the terms of their blood oath when we go to rescue Sumire. Thus, they eventually back us up against Maruki, as well as the possessed Sumire. For as evidence of the damage Maruki's done, he's not helped her get past Kasumi's death. He's only continued to reinforce the false belief that her death is all her fault, and that she herself does not deserve to live over Kasumi being reborn through her, even though her life is the one her sister selflessly chose to save. It is the height of selfishness to deny that wish, that entrusted dream, and that's been the damage Maruki's done, the despair he has trapped her in, that he just refuses to accept or acknowledge. To the point he will do anything to prove himself right, no matter the costs. Yeah, going to get this out of the way because monster tentacles. Part of this is not Maruki's fault. Like Adachi in Persona 4 and Igor previously in this game, Maruki has been possessed by another power. That power being the outer god Azathoth from Lovecraftian mythology, notable as the most powerful of the Lovecraftian outer gods. But despite being the most powerful, it's also known as the blind idiot god because for all its power, all its creations were born through complete accident. It no more understanding the existence it created than anyone else does. Hell, it actually understands it less, because of its own preconceptions about what should be then in that mythos, it leads it to draw the wrong conclusions about basically everything. Thus, were it to awaken and explore its own creations, it would wreck everything around it, trying to fix the things that were not broken, or would have healed on their own. And it's this common trait of misunderstanding everything while thinking they know better is the one it shares in common with Maruki that led the man to awaken that spirit from the Sea of Souls. The Persona Wiki describes this as Maruki being a Persona user, with Azathoth being his persona and true self, but in practice it doesn't really work that way, as Persona users in sync with their true selves don't generate and cannot maintain a palace, as already exampled by Futaba's collapsing when she gained hers. Thus, this can't be him in the driver's seat, but him bearing association with a deity, like Adachi did with Ame no Sagiri, and his desires being hijacked by it. And yeah, that's what's up with the tentacles here. This is Azathoth through Maruki trying to remake everything in the way they think is best, ignoring the harm they do by trapping them in the moment as insignificant in the face of the gains, even though they are all surface level, as they don't actually understand the human mind or heart. This ties back to why I find it questionable whether the game is continuing that fictional stigma about mental health professionals not knowing what they're talking about, as Maruki certainly is one. But from the other parts of his backstory, it just as much seems like he's an abject failure at his chosen career path, so such should not reflect the profession as a whole. I don't know, maybe it might have been better for it to have been revealed that he was operating without a medical license all of this time. You know, out him as a complete fraud like the other cults that frame themselves as alternatives to therapy? Or would have that been too on the nose? But yeah, we're saved from the Hour God-possessed Sumire and Cendrillon by our companions breaking free from the reality-warping brainwashing.
君たちの幸せのためなんだ。幸せ？そうだ。僕は君たちの望みを叶えたかった。
幸せってどういうことだよ。なも俺たちは望んで。
本当にそうなのかい?
And with Sumire saved, we can regroup and figure out what to do. Fortunately, the Velvet Room attendants are back in full form, Lavenza meeting with us and explaining how this all happened, with it being tied to Azathoth's special power of actualization that has been turned up to 11, thanks to the power it got hijacking the Demiurge's system when Mementos was collapsing. Mementos has been maintained despite the ruler's destruction through solely a parasitic hijacking of it, made possible by Maruki claiming to the cognitions of humanity that it was acting to reward the Phantom Thieves, the masses' gratitude at salvation being just the backdoor Azathoth needed to infiltrate and take over. Thus, we're resolved to break this palace as well to finally return everything to normal, once we get Sumire closer back to her proper headspace, as rediscovering herself has not been an easy prospect, but she wants to work through it, for real this time, in the same way that Ren has acted to be her inspiration in continuing to move forward despite any hindrances thrown in her way, as her sister would want nothing but that for her.
お願いします。もう逃げませんから。いつまでも先輩たちに頼ってばかりじゃいられない。私もスミレとして前に進みたいんです。助けられてばかりじゃいられません。逃げて逃げて、あなたにすがって。でも本当はずっと分かってた。上辺だけ霞になってもダメだって。弱いスミレでいるの。もうおしまい。あなただけは最初から偽物じゃなかった。来て、サンドリオン。あなたが出てこないのなら誰がスミレと一緒に行くんです。 て強引な人。でも今のあなたならお似合いかもね。成功という名のガラスの靴。あなたの中にある彼女ごと。我は汝、汝は我。舞踏会の準備はできていて。もちろんです。我は汝、汝は我。再び真実を目指すちぎりをここに得たり。迷いを抜け、現れいでし鎖を砕かんとする意志こそ強き心なり。汝、信念のペルソナの再起に祝福の風を得たり。風はすなわち採用へ至る道筋を照らす導きとならん。
Following this event, the remainder of Sumire's Confidant unlocks, with it focused explicitly around her resolving her imposter syndrome, which Monarchy caused. From how it started with her wanting to do everything with her sister, to it evolving to her acting as Kasumi's copycat to stay around her, and further beyond that, into her resentment that her doing the same things never got her the same achievements, because she was always mimicking another, and never letting herself come out of that shadow, as she felt it was never her place. Kasumi's death changed that, as now, she was in the spotlight and not the shadow, for what they felt was all the wrong reasons. As if she gave up on herself just to be her sister, in reality it would be proving right every dark thought she had about herself that she couldn't outshine or equal Kasumi, even with her now not there to be beside her. What Monarchy prevented was her gaining the chance to grow beyond this, and see the encouragement others were endeavoring all this time to actually give her. As revealed by their gymnastics trainer, Katsumi always saw Sumire as her rival, that she wanted to get better for the both of them, as Sumire always challenged her to be her best, even though Sumire always only saw that as copying her. And it's these little revelations that are things she should have been allowed to realize on her own, or learn of far earlier. Maybe had she not looked down on herself, she could have seen what she's only come to learn posthumously. That had she been honest with her sister, that if she had held faith in herself as Katsumi did, that their tragedy would have never happened. But now knowing the truth, accepting the truth, and being allowed to now be herself and work through her grief properly, it's broken the chains binding her down, so she can now pursue her and her sister's dream unhindered.
先輩のおかげでやっと答えを見つけられた気がします。それに演技するときに大切なことも、私は私の感じるままに表現して、私たちで世界を取ってみせます。我は汝、汝は我。汝ここにちぎりを血明の絆へと転生せしめたり。絆は反逆の翼となりて、魂のくびきを打ち破らん。今こそ汝、信念の究極なる非応に目覚めたり。無尽の力を汝に与えん。見つけた。これが新しい私。
よし。As for her code Geass Parallel, it is easy to mistake her as echoing Chihaya and being like Shirley. But I actually find her arc of being misused and having her entire identity rewritten for others' purposes make her more parallel Maribel Mel Britannia from the Oz the Reflection side story, as well as Layla Malkal in the Akito the Exiled OVA. The latter with how she was being propped up as a false idol through which to garner the people's favor, in following her example through Maruki's forced upon reformation, even though that was not something she wanted for herself. Through Maribel's parallel, it is the character story, while through Layla's, it is the greater arc she plays into regarding another's schemes. And that all helped due to all of their tales coming from side story extensions that occur along the course of the main story, that has central focus placed upon it elsewhere. You don't necessarily need their stories to appreciate the end product, but their additions add more context and flavor to it. But there is a bit of pushback against Sumire for a certain moment here. Yeah, players of the original Persona 5 were not happy about Royal trying to frame Sumire as a true love interest, with a number for focus scenes throughout the game, and even her Phantom Thief attire echoing Joker's in a point-counterpoint portrayal. Especially because players by that point had already selected their own spectrum of, this is the OTP, do not disrupt, for this storyline. And I've made my case for Makoto and Futaba on that myself. But because Persona never locks down a specific canon love interest, there is only ever going to be ones that the fandom prefers. Case in point, a lot of people ship Naoto Shirogane with Persona 4's protagonist, and I'm not against that one at all. It's just, when I played the game, I wanted to exploit an actor illusion joke with the Chie relationship. But, once again, Persona 5 players just took this way too far into thinking Sumire was being depicted as the special OTP, do not steal, when that was not intentional and does not override one's preference for Makoto, Futaba, Haru, or even An or one of the romanceable adults. Because the option for romances is for the player to decide. And honestly, the Paramore arc of Sumire and the others are the ones I promote the most as depicting a healthy relationship. That a positive person in your life is going to help you become your best self. But you can't do it for them or in their name. Only for yourself. And it's through them motivating you to want to be your best self that you can grow your affection for them. For if you can't be your best self for the ones you love, who can you be that for? And the dynamic Ren has with Sumire, in helping her heal with the fake therapist only working to keep her torn down, why wouldn't Sumire fall head over heels for him? Whereas with everyone else, Joker has to be the one to make the push into making the relevant paramour actually consider moving what they have beyond being a crush and friendly affection. So, no. Even here, I don't find Sumire's confession to make her a special. It's just handled differently that makes sense in context to the story she herself has been through, which could have been utilized by any of the others at any point if they so chose to. Granted, a fair amount of help has been handled there with Sora Amamiya's portrayal of both sides of Sumi, the actress best known as Nazuna Nanakusa in Call of the Night, Liliana in Log Horizon, title character Akame in Akame ga Kill, the spirit Vernage in Kamen Rider Build, and of course, the infamous useless goddess herself, Aqua in Konosuba. And frankly, I think Sumi is her best role to date, simply because she has the most empathetic of stories to her. Though that may just be from me not keeping up the best with Call of the Night, and I've never seen Akame ga Kill. I think the developers of this game might be fans of it though, due to how many actors from it and Yuki Yuna as a hero are present in this game, as both series actually have the same creator, Japanese author Takahiro. Regardless, with Sumi healed, we can get back to infiltrating Maruki's palace and the sanitized dystopia he intends to create, which has its own problems, as somehow Azathoth has been able to perceive our progress through other palaces, with ultimately us being locked out of progression simply because the means of moving forward does not exist inside the palace or Maruki's perception of reality, but in fact in Mementos itself. as their palace has drilled a backdoor route into the depths and heart of Mementos, through which it fed upon that power. It even looking as if it has parasitically overtaken the entire rest of the Mementos structure. Traveling into Mementos again also gets us more Phantom Thief cases for changes of hearts. I've not really talked much about these throughout the game, since the majority of them are just side-questing missions, usually with them having some tangential connection to the palace ruler of the current chapter or the prior one, and that is much the case here. But I felt it was relevant to bring them up, because it shows how much Marquis' utopia is anything but. As said before, being put in a state of complete bliss can have debilitating effect on one's psyche by removing any and all motivation for them to do anything. The first case we can get in this chapter represents that well, as the cry for help we respond to is from a child whose mother isn't responding to anything at all. And because their child is, well, a child, they can't care for themselves and will die if she does not respond. This representing from a perspective outside of our own, how that apathy to everything leads to nothing but death and true despair. The second relevant case involves a young man who, due to the death of their parents, was forced to care for their much younger sister, similar to the situation with Sai and Makoto, only with the elder sibling in this dynamic not being old enough to hold down a well-paying job to support them, thus has been destroying themselves trying to make ends meet. It's so extreme a case that the brother had come to resent their younger sibling, wishing that they would just disappear. And so Marquis' wish-granting made it so he wouldn't have to care for her by making him attempt to kill her. It is an act the boy regrets immediately, it having drowned him in his own despair from the forced-upon action. Because in truth, the boy does want what's best for them to both be happy. But that's the danger of this form of wish-granting. Because to give one person everything they want, all an entity Azathoth knows to do is to take from others to fulfill that wish. The boy wants his own life unburdened by his sister? Kill the sister. That should make him happy. Right? Of course not, because we're not sociopathic in assuming we know everything without asking. And there's multiple examples in the in-between segments of situations like this that aren't necessarily tied to form distortions caused by the wish-granting and reality warping. I couldn't find it offhand, but in one of the eye catches between scene transitions, there was this case of a guy who really loved his restaurant, but his main employee quit because they had their wish fulfilled to no longer need to work. That inconvenienced the owner, and so the exact next day, that owner got his wish fulfilled by that employee returning to work, even though they wanted to be done with it themselves. There are thus two conflicting desires that cannot both be fulfilled. One has to brainwash the other to do it against their own wants and needs, even though that fulfilled desire would make it so they'd not want to. And that's no better than slavery itself. Like, Republicans complain that if everyone has a universal guaranteed income, then no one would want to work. But as said, humans are intrinsically designed to be goal-oriented. We always want something, so we'll be willing to work to get it. If someone wants to be a chef, they're going to want to cook for people, so we'll work for a restaurant. But if someone doesn't want to do something, then forcing them to do it will only breed resentment. And when you're stuck doing a job you hate, it can just as much bring about despair as one not having their pursuits acknowledged to begin with. So it's not just the Phantom Thieves that are suffering under a world gone wrong. It's just once more the perception filter altering cognition of reality that is causing a worsening status quo for everyone, to show that we are in the right in wanting to stop Marquis and Azathoth, as their way isn't better, as those whose wishes are being granted are only having them done so to the detriment of the masses. And a system that benefits only a privileged few will never be a more fair system than one that treats all as equal in pursuing the right to achieve their desires, which would be based on merit and effort put in, instead of just wanting it really, really badly. And wanting something to be real, despite a shambling and deteriorating status quo, is something else expressed through Marquis' Palace to once more show how much of a facade and cult it is. The shining, glittering utopic facility for curing everyone's ills, shown to be past the entrance as nothing more than a shambling collection of box forts, distracted from by the appearance of being better externally and on the surface. This further proven deeper in when we find records of Marky's attempts to show his research works, and the truth of what happened to Rumi. For indeed, after the break-in that killed her parents and Rumi's subsequent breakdown, Marky was desperate to try and help her. But the thing Marky wouldn't accept was that it would just take time. Like change, recovery from mental shock is not something anyone can have an instant cure to. Not everyone is going to have an instant epiphany that will snap them out of it. But Marky did not want to wait. He wanted the woman he loved back in his life as soon as possible. He was diving into the depths of despair without her. But what he didn't understand about this was not about him. It was her trauma. Her plight that she needed time to recover from. But he was not willing to give it. So in that desperation to have her back, he didn't consider her at all. As that's when Azathoth came to him. And in his zeal to fix her, erased all of her memories of her loved ones that caused this condition, as well as him. This is the despair at the roots of Marky's distortion. Him fixing the woman he loved in a fast, efficient way that skipped all the healthy processes of recovery, broke her in such a way that they would never be together. Her unable to actually be fixed. And that is the decision he has been seeking to justify to himself ever since. That he was not in the wrong to do that. That such a sacrifice was worth it. That there was no guarantee she'd ever recover without him having done it. He didn't even give her a chance. Didn't consider to see how things would go in a week, a month, even a year. People who are left catatonic after psychological trauma don't stay that way without some type of physical cause. There will be a point where the mental blue screen will end and their mind will reboot. And that's the point where you have to be there for them so they don't relapse, so they can heal. If he loved her, truly loved her, then that was his fucking job to make it so she wouldn't be alone. But instead, he did the same thing he eventually would do with Sumire, and just made her forget her pain and the source of it, not considering that the source of their pain was still impactful to them because they cared that much about them. And this is why Marky's wish-granting keeps failing, as it keeps hinging itself upon people forgetting the things that are important to them in order to trap them in that moment of perceived bliss. But that's why that world can never be utopia, because it's still built on the backs of sacrifice that cannot be forgotten or ignored. You know, even though the royal content came later, I can't help but think the Persona 5 development staff might have been kicking around the idea of this story extension even back when the game was being written in 2014. As in the terms I just put Marky's failure in, it reminded me of a certain Magical Index's New Testament storyline. In it, protagonist Toma Kamijo is trapped in conflict with the magical god Othinus, who has gained the power to rewrite reality as she whims, with the only counter to her power being that of Toma's Imagine Breaker, a supernatural power that acts as a cosmic reset button towards any other supernatural item in negating it. Because of it, Toma is immune to Othinus' reality rewrites, so she is deliberately attempting to break him down. She tortures him through literal millions of altered realities, all designed to break him by him living through scenario after scenario of the very same things she had lived through herself. The isolation, the blame shifting, the assaults on their person. And what finally comes to break Toma is a perfect world. A utopia where none of the atrocities he'd come across and tried to help with or stop the progression of were ever made to happen. It doesn't matter the contradiction in reality that creates. such as suddenly there being 20,000 clones of Mikoto Misaka that were originally made to be murdered by the character Accelerator to try and evolve him into a god, but are still made to exist in this world. Any inconsistencies in that can just be ironed out with Othanus' powers, to make this the true Earth where no one would suffer, with the sole price of that being Toma himself jumping off a roof to his own death. But then that is of course the lie. It can't be a perfect world if you have to keep giving up the things important to them. When those important to Toma would learn the cost paid for their perfect world, it then becomes less perfect. And once that illusion is shattered, it can never be perfect again. Marky is just chasing that same impossible goal that Othanus does in the Raildex franchise. It's just, Othanus doesn't make the excuses Marky does to her actions, as why she did it was just so she could get back to reality where she could be with someone who could empathize with and understand her. Her hang-up being she never even tried to find one in the world Toma knew as his. And ironically, she finds that understanding in the man she spent literally millions of experienced years torturing, until she comes to the realization that it hurt her more to harm him any further than to continue fighting him so he would give up. I am really disappointed the Raildex series hasn't continued to see anime adaptation, and the last Index season that did see it was horribly messed up, as the Altus arc really hits hard, and would have been of major value to see such done right. But my point in this is, Altus sought to change the world because no one in it she believed could empathize with her existed, while Marky threw away the person who loved him just to prove his ways and methods were right. It's again why I consider him the Schneisel equivalent, because that man did the very same thing in throwing away everything he claimed to value just to get his way. And even if Shido may have been involved in why he lost his research grants, that doesn't change the fact that his way of going about this all was done without consent, and in a way that takes what's important away from the patient. And thus, he does need to be stopped. So once we reach his treasure, all we have to do is reach rank 11 with all the party members to unlock the second stage of their persona evolutions. And when Marky comes by, hand him his calling card to begin the confrontation, with him tipping off players who hadn't already figured it out that the cognitive Akechi that's been with us is just another fake person. But even so, why would that dissuade us?
それが僕の反逆だ。あの姿。そしてこの力、君たちはこう呼んでいたね。ペルソナ。行こうか、アザトース。これが最後の戦いだ。
As expected from an outer god, facing off against Marky with Azathoth backing him is a right pain, as its tentacles can act as separate enemies which act as guards against assaulting it, while giving multiple means to hit the team hard and fast. So even max level characters can take some nasty blows from the entity, and not helped by it not only having regeneration among its skill sets, but also status ailments infliction and a rotating weakness and resistance table, so wide area attacks are not a catch-all. It is a very difficult 20 minutes for me moderating party health and damage dealing to finally injure the monster enough so that its hold is broken on Marky, and with it, claim the manifestation of his treasure, a torch. The first torch that lit humanity's future, allowing Marky in his despair over his complete failure to in fact manifest his true persona, and a much more dangerous, true final boss battle.
選んだんだ。みんなが望む幸せのために。な。 みんなの幸せのためなら僕はどうなってもいい。だからもう受け入れてくれ。僕が作る、いや僕とアダム・カドモンが作るこの現実を。僕を好きに使っていい。だから頼む。現実を、みんなが望む現実を。あれは何時。
ここまで来て負けられっかよ。
これくらい耐えてみせるっての。
俺たちの粘り甘く見るなよ。
こんな程度の困難何度だって乗り越えてきた。逃げたら一生後悔しそうだから。私たちの幸せは私たちで決めます。
ここまでしてるんだ。さっさと決めろ。
ナミいけそうか。うん、奴の頭は今防御力ゼロ。今ならいける。頼むジョーカー。
チェックメイト。どうしてなんだ。全てを捨てて全てをぶつけた。それなのにどうして。
In the end, Marquis is just like every other antagonist in this game. Petty men trying to run away from the world because it didn't turn out the way they wanted it, and trying to drag the rest of us, the ones who are trying to make something good in this world, all down with them. And that happens to be quite literal in this case. Marquis' powers going wild in their death throes and dragging Joker back. Meaning that as the metaverse implodes for real this time, far beyond stress with what Marquis done to it, that to conclude this once and for all, there's no persona, no supernatural powers, no changes in mind or cognition overshadowing any of it. It's just two men and the brutal therapy of a fist to the face.
君の目はいつもまっすぐだ。まっすぐ前を見ている。僕は怖かったんだ、きっと。君が望まない現実を作ることが。
With Marquis' reality revisions reversed, this is where the royal content once again coincides with how things ended in the original Persona 5. With Ren forced into jail for breaking parole, and to be used as a witness towards Shido's crimes. Though there are still minor differences, such as Morgana still being here, to show that while the metaverse has returned to its original separate state, its connection has not been completely severed. Instead, it's up to the rest of the Phantoms, and the people they've helped, to argue on Ren's behalf that his actions are not, and never were criminal, to counter the narrative being spun by Shido's co-conspirators and supporters trying to get the politician off scot-free. The result of this is for every blood oath we've obtained, we earn more and more evidence of Ren's true nature, which counteracts the conspiracy's slander, shifting the weight of public opinion enough that the corruption of the system cannot sustain its roots, and is torn out of the dark and into the light. Oya even finding the original woman who Shido assaulted and Ren came to the defense of, convincing her to testify to the true events of that night, which gets Ren's original conviction overturned as the falsified charge that it was. All of which is shown to be possible when the morals of one man, expressing the right values, makes the right choices and acts towards others, influencing hearts and minds with no ill intentions to help them become their best selves. And in doing so, one obtains the power to change the world. And thus on February 13th, Ren Amamiya is declared a free man, allowed to spend the remainder of the school year with his friends as they wish, before stepping out into a brighter future unchained from an oppressive fate.
You can't always get what you want. If you try sometimes, you just might find you get what you need.
Persona 5 is a fantastic game and story, with my primary complaints against it being Atlus's corporate policies towards its player base, the problem in both versions' localization that continued on after it, the backsliding and holding Akechi responsible for his sins, not having the voice actors for the protagonist be allowed to have proper lines to convey Joker as an active involved character in the way he should have been, especially since they got Jun Fukuyama for this, and the mess that is how the game handles Morgana. But overall, in the grand scheme, I'm less likely to make huge grievances towards it as the fandom is, and those that deliberately misrepresent this game, or the others in the Persona franchise. For as you can tell by how long this has taken me to do, there is an excessive amount to say about what it does, and I didn't even really get to all of it. I am never doing a review as long as these happen again. This has been the equivalent of what used to be 18 normal episodes for me. I'm done. As what more can really be said at this point? The game pits you at the bottom rungs of despair, and through determination and perseverance, has you struggle and overcome the world literally being pitted against you. And the parallels to Code Geass and the Japanese cast's other roles merely work to highlight how much this kind of rebellion narrative has been all-consuming in Japanese works trying to help the populace realize their own change of heart to not become trapped by conformity, as there is always a way out. Putting the game in cultural context as well helps showcase how some of the more imbecilic Western takes of the franchise are time and again invalidated for being the ignorant bile that they are. But conversely, while this is a Japanese game primarily intended for Japanese audiences, like many JRPGs, its themes and narrative nonetheless hold importance and sway beyond just that audience, because there is much anyone internationally can learn from it, especially as it pertains to matters about justice. And this actually is brought up in the game itself in the royal content on January 21st, a discussion about clashing views of justice that the game embodies in Akechi and Ren, with such also spoofed from Code Geass as well amongst everything else. In the classical Western sense of justice, one is supposed to follow and enforce the rules for one to be just, even though the enforcement of those laws may be corrupt or their source is corrupt themselves. The idea that those in power are always right, and their might makes right. But as is the argument made in just as many of their tales,
violence is not strength and compassion is not weakness.
And thus, because so much of the modern world is dominated by Western ideologies and capitalistic dogma, regardless of how these mindsets harm others, it ignores the very problems that are exasperating Japanese traditionalistic views about loyalty to a workplace or the values one places in being an active participant in society, even if one does not fit properly in. And if you're an outlier in the existing social system, you're going to be exploited or abused. Whereas Ren and the other Phantom Thieves follow the Eastern philosophies associated with moral justice, that when taking an ethical stance is more important than the consequences, regardless of what those consequences may be and come from in defying one in power. Your might does not make one right. One's moral stances must be the leverage to prove oneself right by proving the resilience of your character day by day, choice by choice, to validate one's position instead of demanding the world change to fit the way one wants to define it. Might for rights, not might makes rights. This again showing why Makoto's chapter of the game, playing itself out as it did, is so important. It, among all the cast members, most thoroughly presents this point of someone bearing such strong convictions that it is impossible to convince them to compromise them. With even the Mariki chapter of the game ultimately proving that one rendered blind will still come to see the truth, as there is no purpose in living a lie. This running theme being another of the concepts lifted near wholesale from other content, but because it is given a chance to breathe as a storyline throughout the entire game, it is all the better for it. And ultimately, that's why I believe Atlus has done so much to re-release the game into every market that it feasibly could, and not just to earn themselves more money from doing so. For what the game is about at its core, in its political messages, its showcase of systemic corruption, and how we are ultimately affected by these things which we can change by just standing up and being involved, it is a story that will last the test of time. As close to 8 years now from its release, that hasn't faded the slightest, as it has remained topical to current events worldwide in a way few other media can hope to claim. For when the world has turned against you and seeks to chain you down, you can't let yourself be enslaved. You can't let yourself be blinded to the truth, to put a filter over your eyes and your ears and ignore all just to get through the day. You can't let yourself be misled by lies claiming to act in your best interests, when those very deceivers have an entire history that showcases they would happily sell you out or throw you to the wolves as a scapegoat. And you can't let yourself be held in cult-like devotion to men undeserving of our worship. The world isn't a simple, pretty place, but the biggest source of corruption in it are always going to be the ones telling you that there are no problems at all, and distract you from the real issues that cause your suffering. And in the face of all that, in the throes of so many monsters trying to gain control of your lives, your values, to steal away your independence and autonomy, all you can do in the end is aim to misbehave. In 2016, a group of Japanese teens were ostracized for crimes they did not commit. These young men and women probably escaped from indoctrination into the Tokyo underground. Today, still wanted by a government conspiracy, they survive as soldiers of fortune, stealing back the world from the corruption of distortion. If you have a problem, and no one else can help, and if you can find them, maybe you can hire the Phantom Thieves of Hearts. And it's time to get to work.